All right. So, this podcast is far too long in the making, and I can't stress that enough. But I'm just going to jump right into it. This is the Metacast. God, that was a little cringe. I don't really care. All right, my guest today. Kevin, how do you pronounce your last name again?
It's pronounced de Kuyper, Kevin de Kuyper.
Kevin de Kuyper. And then we have Wallace, it's
Roger Wallace.
I don't know how I screwed that up. Alright, so Roger Wallace is a good friend of mine. We used to crack commie skulls back in Berkeley. And then...
Yeah, we used to mess with them and yell at them.
I know, you were the one cracking their skulls.
Yeah, and then I was just being provocative and mean as hell.
I mean, I don't know if you can really be mean to communists. They're not really people, so...
yeah, I know, but I was getting all in their sign and shit.
That was funny. Kevin, so you are the leader and founder of Nationalists United, and if I can summarize it, for the most part, it is an international coalition of traditionalist nationalists, correct? Would you sum it up in that way, or would you give a different definition?
Absolutely. What we're doing is forming a cohesive movement to really bring all these traditionalist-minded nationalists together, united under this single creed, and unlike kind of the populist movement where they let in any old ideology as long as they support this notion of the free market Trump movement or all these disparate liberty-minded people that are so divided. What we're trying to do as Nationalists United is bring people together under the creed of traditionalist morals and traditionalist values, and not just for America, for example, but for all nations to adhere to their culture, not the multiculturalist societies that we're moving into. And the globalism being one of the greatest threats, and cultural Marxism, the greatest threat to traditionalism, we're see ourselves as the number one threat to these terribly dangerous movements.
Oh yeah, could I kind of give a little take? Also, we want to basically smash globalism and cultural Marxism, but one of our biggest goals is to smash and resist the Kalergi Plan. That's Klergi, Kalergi.
You want to give a little synopsis on what the Kalergi Plan is exactly, for those who may be listening that don't know?
Oh yeah, so Richard Coudenhove Kalergi, godfather of the European Union, who he was a half Japanese and half Austrian noble, and his name is Richard von Coudenhove Kalergi, and they have a Coudenhove Kalergi European Society and the Charlemagne Prize, and it's basically Coudenhove Kalergi wanted to, as an alternative to World War I and World War II, was this one globalist cosmopolitan, or he was the godfather of modern globalism. He wanted to replace European or ethnic Europeans with a lower IQ, more docile stock. And he said the diversity of individuals would be replaced by the diversity of personality, or the diversity of races would be replaced by diversity of individuals and diversity of personalities. So he wanted to destroy the European race for a more docile, lower IQ stock. And even if Richard Coudenhove, even if there is no Kalergi Plan on paper, the spirit of his ideas of replacing European people is going on in Canada, United States, New Zealand, Australia, and even and to a big extent in Western Europe. So, and people get to Coudenhove Kalergi European Society Prize, and they get the Emperor Charlemagne Prize if they actually promote basically white genocide or replacement. I like to use the word replacement because I think white genocide is more appropriate for South Africa, but I think it could be used for any of them. And what's weird about the Coudenhove Kalergi European Society is that one of the counselors of it is Angela Merkel, and and also Juncker. All right.
How honest and surprising.
Yeah, and then it's just she also gets the Charlemagne Prize, which is also done by his disciples who follow his plan, and it's basically very dysgenic in the way that instead of like promoting a better, more intelligent people, they're promoting more like lower intelligent, more docile people. And I think a large part of replacing ethnic European has to do with IQ levels and docility.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself, personally. You always seem to be quite the almanac.
Mm-hmm.
And I appreciate that, guy.
Well, I mean, I did read his book, Practical Idealism. So, like, for those who saying that the Kalergi plan isn't real, he literally wrote an entire book detailing the plan. So there's no way that it isn't. Am I allowed to swear?
I try and refrain from it. I don't, because this is going to go on YouTube, even though I'm going to have it on multiple platforms. I'd like to try and somewhat minimalize the censorship that I'm going to face. However, I honestly couldn't care less but just try and refrain from using super vulgar language.
Okay, fine, but it's freaking real, okay? And by the way, we have another guest on the line named James Ellis, and let's see if we can answer him while we hear Kevin DeKuyper talk a little bit about his group.
Yeah, so give us maybe an outline of some goals, perhaps, and just the whole, what you guys have been doing and so I guess a better way to put it is where do you see the organization going in the next 5 years? Where do you hope to see it go?
Right. So what's really important about Nationalists United is that we are going to create an overarching movement and almost an umbrella group, or you could say, of absolute nationalism. And what this is able to do is it's really able to bring anyone that believes in the nationalist message together. There's so many different factions within overall nationalism, because you could have, say, these national socialists, different disparate factions of authoritarianism or meta-right, or the list goes on and on about all these different groups, and they compete against each other and they don't help each other out. What we're trying to do is provide the resources, the organization, and the infrastructure in order to bring these groups together as a coalition of like-minded men and women with like-minded goals. And so what's really important is we spread and disseminate this ideology. Nationalism really is this unifying pride and this devotion to your own country, your own citizens, the people that make the country. And there was an immortal kind of value, which is based on this traditional morals, these traditions, all these history that your country has faced. No matter where you are in the world, you believe in these same like-minded traditionalist goals that country and civilization. And so what we're able to do is bring these people together, and we're, as Nationalists United chapters that are forming right now, is we're able to have boots on the ground. We're able to communicate with these different, especially Republican groups, to bring them to our side, teach them that it's not about this, big tent, everyone could just become this homogenate or not homogeneated faction of what they call Republicans, but instead we could actually unite people together under nationalism. An actual aesthetic that we have with Nationalists United is black and white, because we really do teach that there are objective morals, and if one isn't adhering to these concepts, that there are values that one could adhere to that are what we call degenerate, or it's damaging to their health and their essentially their civilization. If we could bring people into healthy morals and traditional values and protect their nation, the culture and values of their nation, then we could build an absolutely beautiful, purified movement, and that's what's really going to make the difference in the long run. So, we believe in self-determination, and we believe that we should not answer to any outside of your country. You believe in your own self-interests and protecting your national borders. So there's a whole lot of policy points that we intend to spread throughout the world and have people join our movement. and that's only just the start of it.
Definitely,
Well,
definitely. Did you want to say something?
yeah, and definitely we're not like civic nationalism, because civic nationalism is like a French revolutionary. It's like French liberalism. It's saying that it doesn't race doesn't matter, culture doesn't matter. Everyone will homogenize, or everyone will become one thing, and we'll all go kumbaya and sing along. But that doesn't work out. If
It's
you
wishful
see
thinking.
what's going on with these multicultural societies without a national identity and these parallel kind of cultures that are very vastly different and divergent, it's leading to really, as many would have to say, nothing but just pure trouble, and it's causing people to self-segregate. People aren't integrating. So as for America, we would like to hopefully get from the white majority from like 60, 65, 70. It's around 70 because it includes white Hispanics and like other people, to about like maybe 80, 85. While more with Japan, we would like to have them. With Europe, we would like to have a Japanese model where, Germany for the Germans, Italy for the Italians, where it's reserved to the native stock, and other people who are foreigners can be given honorary citizenship, but very limited in amount. Because in America, we have the Virgin Islands, we have Samoa, we have Hawaii, and before the social engineering, the black population wasn't being used as bullets against the country, and they weren't being engineered to fall into this cultural Marxist debt. And we could have that wiggle room. We had, even from 1900 to 65, we had Chinese people coming here, we had Japanese people coming here, but it wasn't to a large extent, and that's what people don't realize. We can have immigration from other places and have a supermajority. It just can't be civilizational changing immigration. And in America, we're a little bit bigger. We can have that kind of wiggle room, but we cannot. But we need a majority population.
No, we definitely do. At the end of the day, we are, a European society. We're supposed to be an extension of our homelands. A home away from home.
And also, I wanted to add, if you look at demographic voting patterns, it's only ethnic Europeans that actually believe in kind of this constitution, in free speech, and the Second Amendment, and the all these other amendments that are in the Bill of Rights, and the left is trying to flood us in with this invasion. And it's like, I almost think they're only picking Mexico, Latin America, and a lot of other undeveloped countries from I guess now they're picking the Middle East, but it's mainly undeveloped countries that they're picking in, like literally the worst countries, and even Haiti. It's like, I think they're bringing in the lowest places in the Americas, while in Europe they're doing it with Arabs and sub-Saharan Africans of Islamic variety, but in America they're doing it with Central Americans and Haitians and other people, and they're doing it so that they could essentially eviscerate the Constitution, and having a supermajority of a certain race will kind of protect the constitutions and at least protect our customs, our statutes, and our ideals from being completely destroyed. Because if the demographic change happens and an invasion and open borders continues to go on, or it hasn't been going on in recent years, but let's say it actually does, we won't have a constitution. It'll be a figment of the imagination. We already see what they're doing with the Second Amendment, and that's why constitutionalism doesn't work.
Yeah. What I wanted to go back to a little bit real quick was, I wanted to add on to what Kevin was talking about in terms of the nationalist aesthetic that's been kind of growing into something a little bit more than what everyone probably expected it to be. It's because it's as not just an aesthetic, it's the foundation. Traditionalist nationalism, it's the foundation of any third positionist ideology in anything that's right of center in general. It's
right.
It's a very, very, very important key element, I think, that it's one of those things where everyone can agree on, first and foremost, definitely, and it's somewhere, it's that sort of area that allows us some wiggle room to come together more so. It's very good. So what I think I'll do, we'll switch gears a little bit towards something I was going to have Roger talk about. Mr. Lewis, do you want to talk about the urbanites and the difference between urbanite culture and rural and suburban culture. You had talked about it in the podcast that we attempted to put together, but I didn't think it was adequate enough. So you had some really good points when you originally sort of sold me on.
Okay.
Told me
So
what urbanite culture is and all that, and it's kind of eye opening, I think. So why don't you go try and keep it a little bit more concise, because I love you, but you do tend to go off the rail a little bit with there's just a little bit too much verbal stimulation, but.
Okay, so what goes on is that cities, with a lot of these things, a lot of these internationalism starts from like urban cities, and you know about urban cities, right? Urban cities have a density.
I was going to say, just to interject for a second, I'm actually an urbanite, so I might be able to help you out a little bit with clarification.
Okay. All right. I mean, that sounds good, but urban cities have density of, and by the way, I think you should get out of that area. But anyways, urban cities have density of population, which also means density of sensation. So with density of opportunity, and also density of population, there's density of sensation, like drugs, sex, and alcohol. And if a city is on an island or a peninsula, let's go see like New York, which is on an island, or San Francisco, which is on a peninsula, and then it tends to become its own isolated echo chamber or thought bubble.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know about Toronto. Is Toronto? I don't think Toronto's on an island or anything.
No, not at all. But Toronto's still in that sphere of influence.
Toronto is not really coastal, but it still is surrounded by mountains. So it's still kind of somewhat isolated or nested. I believe so. Don't get me on that one. But if a city is like, usually if it's peninsula, or if it's on an island, or if it's surrounded by mountains, or in between a valley, it becomes isolated and it becomes its own echo chamber.
Yeah,
like
it usually becomes a lot worse when it's on an island or peninsula. When it's not as bad. But you can really see the distinction.
Yeah, but let me
true.
finish.
I was going to say just another point, if I could add, is just that it seems to be that major trade ports are also a reason for that sort of disintegration of a national identity. It seems like the more trade is in a certain city, the faster that cultural degradation can take place.
That can be true, especially in a free trade world. But before I kind of go off the rails, I was kind of saying that yes, that density of opportunity becomes a kind of an echo chamber. And especially bourgeois cities that don't have a manufacturing base, they attack these bourgeois, and the bourgeois has an edifice complex. We see with a lot of these left-wingers and a lot of these cosmopolitan kind of, these global citizen-minded people, or what I call coastal or liberal elite. They basically, they have that global citizen mindset. And that's what cities kind of emphasize. They emphasize the lack of identity, especially if it's only like service sector and entertainment oriented. And because of the sensation of drug, sex, and alcohol, a lot of young people, they go in there to get a head start in their life. People who are decently capable, decently intelligent, and the cost of urbanite dwelling, along with all the hedonism, not just the drug, sex, and alcohol, but also the instant gratification from consumerism, sucks them in. So it basically creates an evolutionary dead end or childless lifestyles or anti-natalist views. That's why they're also very promotive of abortions, and that's not a reproductive strategy. That's a dead end. And so that's why a lot of homosexuals, transsexual, and a lot of the LGBT and pedophiles also like cities, because it's childless, and also the density of opportunity also gives density of population, but also gives density of degeneracy, and more people, more degeneracy within a given area because of the density. And the only people, and because those people aren't reproducing, they have to drive demographic change by importing third worlders that they're going to go vote farm. Like a lot of people from third world countries will be paid off for welfare.
Well, with that, they're trying to stabilize the population because, like you said, a childless society can't sustain itself.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that an urban center will do is dehumanize the population, because when you get into a community that large, there's absolutely no way to have a tight-knit community or, you know, a group centered around. That's why you see in cities, there's like sometimes communes can work in cities because you can actually isolate a community within a community. Mm-hmm. That's a completely separate topic, but just to go to show you that it's why there's that incredible stereotype where somebody can get killed, and this is, you know, quite a true stereotype where somebody could be stabbed or shot in New York City and people will just walk on by. They won't even pay any attention to them. So in addition to all the things that Roger said, you know, with the degeneracy and the density of population comes tremendous dehumanization of one's fellow neighbor. And I think that's a tragedy in itself.
Yeah, an urbanite dwelling, I said, is very expensive to live. So the only people who are actually producing and living families are people being paid to live there for migratory vote farming and being vote farmed. Welfare moms, third world migrants, homeless people who are just being given all this free cash just to be, you know, drug addicts and bums. And
I was going to say it's both the wealth incentive that's given to some, especially migrants, and I wouldn't say it's a financial motivation for the homeless, but they also have no motivation to prevent pregnancy. So that happens. But with the immigrants especially, you have to remember that these people are coming from other cultures. And when they first arrive at the city, their cultures haven't disappeared, and their culture tells them to have children, while ours tells them not to. And that it leads to an instant shift, just right there in the first generation.
Yeah, and then also, if you look at a lot of feminism and SJWs, they're only 8% of our population. SJWs, so that includes all SJWs. That includes feminism, cultural Marxists, all these crazy, you know, radical social justice activists. And it's actually anti-feminism is 1/3 of the population, while actual social justice with the feminist and all this other shit is about 8%, maybe 9%, but it's around 8% of the population because, you know, they don't really...
I think you give them a generous number there. I think it's actually much less than that. I think that this force is probably closer to 3 to 5% by any reasonable metric. I mean, I know it has more appeal, but I think that's just people falling in line. But in terms of like the hardcore activists who actually push this apathy and nihilism in culture, this cultural Marxism, I think it's a smaller proportion than that.
Well, I know that a lot of...
But they're the loudest.
No, definitely. That's what I agree with. They're most definitely the loudest group. But I think that it really says something because they're quite a tiny fraction when it comes to the overall population.
I wanted to say when I classify SJWs or when the statistics classify SJWs, it also classifies a lot of these tech companies that enforce social justice, a lot of, you know, these urban elites and these urban workers or these service sector workers that enforce social justice. So it's not just those people waving up signs. You know what I mean? It's also kind of the people in the education institution and, you know, it's a much bigger category than, you know, just those sign waivers.
Well, I don't know. I could definitely see where you're coming from, but I would combine the activists with those professors because there's not that many professors. I think that intellectual edge for cultural Marxism is, again, another tiny fraction. But again, they're the loudest because I've had teachers that have agreed with my politics in college, and they, you know, tell me that they simply can't express it openly. And I think that happens more often than you might think.
Yeah, it happens more often than not. But the thing is that oh yeah, James cut off for a bit, but let me keep going.
You're good. How about we tie this back now into what you were talking about, how the contrast between the urbanite culture and then comparing that with suburban and rural America. And sort of
like
rural,
the nuclear family we all want to get back to.
Yeah, I will. So as I was leaving off, I said that, you know, they have to import foreigners to bolster their ranks because they don't reproduce. While humans traditionally have been living in suburban and rural areas, if you can pull up the graph, rural, suburban areas and small-sized cities to mid-sized cities are all about roughly, rural areas are 90% pro-nationalist and they voted for Trump, and medium to small-sized cities were about 75% to 80%, and so on and so forth. because those people, they have a national identity. If you try to be a weirdo, try to be a degenerate, and try to act like like an outcast, you'll stand out in rural, suburban areas and smaller to medium-sized cities. And also, those cities are usually cities like Oklahoma City, which expands into flat land. And they touch the suburbs and they touch the countryside. They're not isolated. So you see that traditionalism from the rural and suburban areas pushing back against the degeneracy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when we were in Oklahoma City last year, I could definitely see that. And you can kind of feel it in the air.
Yeah, like there's definitely a pushback.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what kind of goes on. But humans, since we have been a kind of a rural, kind of suburban population, is more in line with traditionalism, which is more in line with nationalism, which tries to go through evolutionary instincts, and it doesn't try to deconstruct and destroy human nature. It goes with human nature. And, suburban and rural areas are more in line. So you see nationalist child rearing and big population. The very white pill in all of this is that almost more than half of private liberal arts universities will go out of business, while conservative Christian universities will actually, according to Steve Turley, you can see him, Dr. Steve Turley, check out his YouTube if you ever have a chance. He was saying that conservative Christian universities are actually enrolling more because people who are conservative Christians are having more children, and nationalists are having more children than traditionalists, while liberals are having less. And you also see a rapid decline in enrollment in the public liberal universities, because also the public liberal globalist universities also has a low fertility rate for their adherents.
I was going to say, because even in a liberal city like I'm in, you see that the conservative colleges are doing far better than the liberal ones. The liberal ones are either shut down or they're moving into being public universities and things like that. New York is pretty famous for its universities, but if you look around at the top colleges, they're all privately owned and they're all right-wing universities.
Yeah. Yeah, so one thing I'm going to go into now, I want to go back to Kevin just for a little bit. I wanted to ask you a question, Kevin, and this is more of a...
Before you go into Kevin, I want to say one thing.
Go for it.
Actually, no, never mind. I was saying that with the anti-natalist views and with welfare reform, we could eventually boost ethnic European birth rates and the right-wing people who are mostly made up of that demographic, and we can boost those, and we can use that.
That's definitely a heavy topic for another day.
It's a good topic.
That's a thorough topic, though, that we would need to discuss. There's a lot to go into with just that sentence alone.
All right, fine.
You're good.
An actual strong, very hardline policy, and that promotes this traditional nationalism. And so the inspiration that I started Nationalists United is that I was told by numerous people, nationalists is such a dirty word, you can't use it, you got to be more sensitive, you're going to get attacked. Well, I really don't care what they think. If it's such a taboo word, then it needs to be out in the public and normalized, and so people understand what it is, and so that they could essentially learn that they actually do believe in these topics. So it's done tremendous gains over these last 3 months since its formation. I mean, I have over 5,000 followers on Facebook, and we're growing at a dramatic pace on all these other platforms that we're starting up now. So I'd say the crux of it all is that if you stand by your convictions and truly know what's best for the people's interest, that's what's going to start a movement, and people will see that bravery and want to stand by it.
Yeah, that's definitely huge. I was going to just add to that, just because that's really what's important, is the Overton window has definitely shifted in the last 4 years. I think with Donald Trump's election, what's kind of hilarious is you have these very far-right people who supported him because he was being demonized by the media and everything, and it created this vicious circle where they've basically labeled Donald Trump a Nazi, despite him never changing his views of basically being just a more right-wing Democrat, if you really think about his policy. And he's never really strayed from what that means, but since they've labeled him a Nazi for so long, it's shifted the Overton window to the point where nationalism is no longer a dirty word, not in the minds of most people. I remember seeing some polls, I can't cite them off the top of my head, but more than 50% of the country sees nationalism and patriotism as an acceptable term and an acceptable thing to be. And like you said, if people hold to their convictions and they actually say what they believe in and they stand by it, I think things will actually begin to change, because the reason our culture is degraded to the point it has is because people have just given ground every time that these people push against them. And we've gotten to the point where we can't take it anymore, because if we do, the country will just be gone.
Absolutely. So it's a big shift, a turning point, essentially, that we're on the edge. We changed very dramatically into this Kalergi plan agenda kind of internationalized community. It's global homo, or we could actually restore and protect our own people.
Yeah, see, from my perspective, I view it as Trump was a big cultural win. You know, he was a battle won, but not a war won.
Right.
We're kind of seeing now. Sorry, go on.
I'd say he was more of a cultural win, but he wasn't like a complete political victory. I think he collapsed this neoliberal clown world empire, and he kind of collapsed the deep state. But then I think we have to build up from the ashes.
Yeah,
for sure. I think what really happened there, if I just may add, because I think this is something that people don't really appreciate too much, is just the fact that it seemed as though, even though he wasn't much different than, you know, the rest of the, because he's not much different than like President Bush or anything like that, either one of them, but they wanted so badly to continue their narrative that they basically turned even a slight change into, you know, labeled as the far right. Mm-hmm. So at this point, they can only go to the very extremes, and that turns most people off. And I don't think that they were realizing that if they lost that one battle, that the momentum of the culture war would completely shift. Oh, yeah. And I think that's where we're at now, with the culture war being completely in our favor, at least for the time being.
It was a total snowball effect.
Yes, most definitely.
In its totality, there could not be a more simplified version of what of what happened and what's going on. You know, like, I remember what's crazy too is leading right up to the election, you could see things escalating, you know, because that was when transgenderism was starting to come about and people were starting to really get into that. And then, like, right when Trump had, you know, declared his campaign, that was when shit seemed to hit the fan on the left. And then once he actually won, then it was like a fucking asteroid devastating a planet. You know, it devastated their whole little world that they live in. And it's hilarious.
It popped the bubble for sure.
Oh yeah,
they're as they said in what was it when Bush was president, the bubble burst. That that definitely happened.
Yeah, and it's I think I just find it all funny, because the left, what they've done is they've pushed us, like you guys kind of touched on a little bit earlier. They pushed us to the edge of a cliff. And now that we're fighting back, they're like, what? What? You guys are fighting back now? This isn't fair. You know what I mean? They're like, time out. You know, screaming mommy and asking for handouts and help and shit. And
oh yeah, that reminds me. There was a funny video of an Antifa guy, and then like this one black woman who's his mom just yells at him with her like strong Southern accent, and she says, "What are you doing?"
I saw that. She's like slapping him.
Oh yeah.
Makes him go back inside. I was going to say that's what I was kind of compounding on with that point that you just made, how they pushed us to the edge of the cliff. The one thing that I don't think they realized, though, is they were basically boiling frog. I'm sure you've heard of that analogy where you can boil a frog and it won't jump out of the water. But they made a big mistake with the 2016 election where they pretty much turned the temperature up so much that the frog jumped out.
Yep.
And that's basically what happened, was they were on their way to a total victory, I think, in terms of the culture war. Yep. If you look at like media from back then, they pretty much made it out like, hey, you're never going to stop this tidal wave. Mm-hmm. And since they were kind of mild, it was kind of just going all their way. But they pushed so far to the left and to such an extreme that everybody was like, wait a minute. We see that they're doing something a lot more than what they're saying. And that's when they started bringing out, you know, the drag queens that talk to children and all this strange gender bending stuff. Things that, you know, before they kept tucked away, now they bring it to the forefront. And people aren't going to stand for it. They're not ready for it. And they should never be ready for it. Let me keep that in mind. It's not something that's natural, so that's why people push against it.
Most indubitably. All right, so now what we'll do is we'll get into the last little segment. What I was going to have James touch on was in environmentalism, and I just kind of wanted to get really his thoughts and opinions on the direction that he feels we would need to go in order to create a more sustainable and both economically and ecologically humane society. And if you will, I will hand it off to you, and we'll probably continue for about another 10-15 minutes, and then we'll have to wrap it up, because this is, I don't know where this is at yet, but we're starting to get, I think we're at the 45-minute mark.
Oh, that's fine. We could just edit some of it out. But definitely, in order to get to a society that's more friendly with nature, because one thing that people misunderstand, I think, about a lot of Republicans is they have this idea, whether it's Republican or really anybody on the right wing, is that they hate nature. And I don't think anybody's ever been of that opinion. Even the industrialists, like the old-time industrials, didn't seek to just destroy nature. So it's kind of a weird position that a lot of right-wing people are in. But what we need to do is, instead of promoting these policies like the Paris Accords and these weird climate deals, because all they do is they're a money grab. If you look at the actual policies, nothing is going to happen when you have, some of carbon producers reduce their emissions, or a lot of these policies. But you look at Japan and China, more specifically, and India, these are where the actual pollution of the world is coming from. And instead, they're focusing on things like greenhouse gases, and especially the first world. And there's easy statistics to follow that show that even if you take our emissions to even in the negatives, our pollution output and our emission output, we're not actually going to have any effect globally, because these other countries are so atrocious with their behavior and their abuse of the earth. So what we need to do is actually start promoting policies that are directed towards the aggressors and towards the people who are actually doing damage. But in the meantime, you need to actually live in a way that helps the environment, because if you don't actually care about your own surroundings and you don't actually care about your own community, it's going to be really hard to project those feelings onto other people or to express why it's a good thing to do. And I think that's one thing that a lot of these people don't understand.
I also wanted to say that our carbon emissions have actually been going down, I think, to Center for Industrial Progress.
They've been going down dramatically. The first world has always been reducing the amount of emissions and the amount of pollution that they put out, but only the first world. If you look at the third world and developing nations, their pollution output is only going up, and 90% of the plastic in the oceans is actually coming from Asia and Africa. And to say that we need to change our lifestyles in Europe and North America and Australia, saying that we need to change our lifestyles to fix the earth, when we're not the ones who are causing the problem, I think that's absurd.
Well, also, I'd also want to say that in a really crazy way, that a lot of this is for like eco-communism or global eco-communism or eco-centralization, where they have these big corporations and governments basically taking land from small businesses. And I think that's a big part of the Paris Accords and a lot of these globalist kind of the globalist agenda behind climate change. I mean, otherwise,
I can actually add to that. Let me tell you a bit of a personal experience I had. I was actually spoken to by a fracking company that was disguising itself as a environmentalist company, and they were basically spreading lies about how fracking doesn't cause any of the issues that it normally does. Things that are very provable and very obvious. You can Google a video of their tap water starting on fire, but this company was trying to just convince me with spreadsheets that it wasn't happening. So I think that it relates more back to money more or less of the time. It's not so much an ideology, the reason that they push these weird policies. It all relates back to money. And that's, again, why the Paris Accords was basically nothing more than a fine that we would be paying, we're like the worst aggressors of pollution. We would be paying them to do nothing for absolutely no reason. And we would have to reduce our economy in the process. So I think it really just goes back to money and these companies having too much influence and undue influence over our country.
Yeah. So one thing I did want to put my opinion out, though. So for me, fracking has been a gray area because we do hear a lot about how fracking.
I think that the problem is the efficiency. We waste more of the source that we're gathering. We waste more of it than we can gather, and I think that fact alone should tell you not to do it. And because we can't gather that fuel, it ends up leaking out into the surrounding areas and causing pollution. And for me, that's a no-go zone. You shouldn't be wasting fuel and polluting the earth.
Well, it's not fracking that causes it necessarily. I think I saw something on the news about it. And it's not fracking. It's the fact. It's actually the fact that a lot of companies don't want to invest in filtration systems and don't give a damn about the environment, and they don't actually if they wanted to.
And that's why they should be made to care.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm saying it's not fracking. It's more the way it's being done. Because fracking itself, it's just like a knife.
Yeah, because there aren't any actual connections that directly show fracking as polluting water. I remember I think it was Gasland. It was a documentary. It might have been Gasland, but I watched, it was a segment done by this gentleman. I can't remember his damn name, but he used to be on a pretty big show. I think it was Dateline, was it? I think it might have been Dateline, or it was some show like that, and there was claims being made by someone who was saying, that his water had been polluted by this fracking company and stuff. But they had people come out doing tests, and they came to the conclusion that the water pollution didn't come from fracking because there weren't any actual chemicals in the water that were coming from the fracking fluids. And a lot of the times that this happens, where people are like, my water is ignitable and whatnot. But it's actually just a lot of the times it's because of just natural methane that that seeps into some people's water reserves. But like I said, it's a gray area. I can't really take one side on either or, but I think it's definitely an issue that needs to be addressed more so. It's one of those things where there isn't enough studies out there to where we can produce a very conclusive argument, or a very conclusive conclusion.
I was going to say, I wouldn't give a conclusive answer, but what I would say is that from what I've seen, not just in terms of fracking, but with any company, is that every company will try to seek the simplest and cheapest solution so long as it's legal. So as long as we don't have any rules that tell them that they need to collect more of the fuel, that they need to be less damaging and less polluting to the environment, until we have those types of laws, even if it can be passed in one, because I'm not a big fan of having a million laws on the book. But you need to have some sort of regulation there. Otherwise, they're always going to waste and pollute the area. Exactly. Because the thing is, there's truth on both sides of those arguments. And there's truth on the side where it says that it is polluting the area. Because, like you said, it's not fracking directly. It's the way that they're doing it and what they're leaving behind. That causes the pollution. So if you do it right, yes, I don't have any problem with it and I would support it. But the thing is, if you don't have any way to enforce them doing it the right way, they're not going to do it the right way. It's the same reason that we buy cheap products from other countries, because if it was just as cheap to do it the right way, we would just get everything from American labor. But since it's easier and cheaper to do it somewhere else, we let little kids do it very haphazard. So it's very similar in that sense.
Well, I wanted to say one thing. I wanted to say that it's okay to have regulations, but it's not okay to have destructive or regressive bureaucracies, and that's what people don't understand. Having simple regulations is different than just having a kind of a regressive bureaucracy.
Definitely, oh, yeah. The bureaucracy needs to be limited.
Certainly.
Yeah, I don't think it's against regulations. We should be for proper regulations, but we should be against crazy bureaucracies.
Yeah, certainly. All right, well, let's see. All right, Kevin had to go because if I remember correctly, he gave up some work time to do this podcast with us. But he definitely gave some good points, and I'm really fortunate we had him on. We'll try and have him on in the future. Hopefully we can have Kane on as well. Is there...
Definitely. Once we get into a regular rhythm, I'll be on time and he'll be able to stay longer.
Yeah.
I think we should not really. I think we should push on other ends besides Kane, because I don't want to do anything that might jeopardize Kane. I think we should kind of do our own thing and then just let kind of Kane do his. And
we can talk about that more later.
So are we going to end the podcast there?
Yeah, we can talk about more of that a little later. We don't want to get too off topic. I want to wrap this up. Is there a few more points you might want to make, James, before we kind of conclude?
Since we're going to have to edit this out, what should the last point be? I can give a pretty coherent point on something.
What do you feel is the most or the biggest threat to our environment right now, and what is the best solution to combat what you believe is the worst possible hurdle that we have? Like, you know, like an example is like how, you know, bees are going extinct, or how, you know, Monsanto has such a grasp on certain companies or whatnot.
Definitely. I definitely think I can touch on that. I'll touch on a more general point more globally, and then I'll specifically touch on that B point because I think that's a really good thing that the average person can do. I think globally the issue is simple but controversial, and that is developing nations. Developing nations are the number one source of pollution in the world, and they're the number one source of damage. But obviously it's very controversial to confront countries like that, to try to force them to our standards. So I think we need to find a way to cooperate with those types of countries so we can actually get help to them without seeming imperialistic or like colonizers, as the left likes to say, because obviously it's going to be very politically volatile, even just trying to help, because it always is seen that way. So we need to find a way to put pressure on these people, on these countries rather, so they can start cleaning up their countries. I know Britain does a lot with India in order to clean up their sanitation work. So we need to be more involved with cleaning up, I believe, plastics and pollutions, specifically coming from places of like Indonesia and India. Because China's pretty bad, but they can handle the problem themselves if they have proper international pressure. But with countries like India and Indonesia, they just don't have the means. So we need to show them simple ways that they can clean up their environment. And then, as I said before, we need to relate it back to their everyday life so they feel inclined to fix their countries and their communities. Because I actually remember seeing in a documentary a family in Indonesia which was polluting its own river. And they said that they were doing it simply because that they were making more money doing that than it was worth to keep their country clean and to keep their community clean. Jesus and I thought Christ. That was a very much of a shame. That's what I mean. So we need to help people have better options, basically. Yeah. But to relate it back to something small, Roger, let me just finish this point. Just relate it back to something small you can do in your everyday life, especially if you're an urbanite or you live in a rural area, as we were talking before, is buying a small honey bee farm, or a honey bee's nest rather, is a great way to help the environment in so many ways, because they are endangered and it's an essential species to our existence. I believe they should just be called like symbiotic at this point, because without bees we would basically have quite a bit of vegetation die and a huge famine on our hands. So if you could actually have your own personal nest, or a personal hive rather, that would help your community and your environment tremendously.
Yeah, I used to live on a ranch when I was in high school, and we had Jesus, I don't even know how many bee boxes. We probably had at least 100 bee boxes, big bee boxes. We had this gentleman who would he basically would go around to all the different farms and just be like, hey, you know, can I put some bee boxes out? I'll take care of them. You don't have to do anything, and you'll get honey out of it too for free. And it was a very, very, very mutual, beneficial little thing we had going. And I had you know, actual, real, authentic raw honey for the first time because of that. And there's a huge difference. And I feel like, you know, when you have real, actual,
and in the nutritional value with it too.
Yeah,
it's really good for you.
You can live off of honey. It has all the nutrients you need in it, and it's an antiseptic. So if you have a cut, an open cut, a wound, you can put honey in it, and the honey will help protect it, because since it's got such a thick viscosity that
it's also a preservative, which I don't know if you would want to really preserve anything important. Yes, but because honey doesn't spoil, I don't know if you know this, but they've actually found honey in Pharaoh's tombs, like 3,000-year-old honey, and it's completely edible. Well, technically edible. I'm sure there's some toxins on it by now, But so theoretically, you can actually store stuff in honey, and it won't actually, decay very quickly.
Oh wait, James. I wanted to relate something. So would you also support like kind of putting pressure on Brazil to stop cutting down its Amazon forest, because all the eco biosphere is connected? Yeah. And would you also like kind of like put pressure on like Africa to stop like killing off its four-legged species?
I think that, especially with the rainforest ordeal, is that any rainforest needs to be protected simply because it doesn't grow back. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but when you cut a rainforest down, there's no way to actually recuperate the land because the nutrients are actually built up in the plant life themselves. So it's a self-sustaining ecosystem, but once it's destroyed, it's pretty much gone forever, as far as I know. So I would definitely protect that. Well, I know that the rainforest.
Well, there is cases where they did. Certain areas where they didn't cut the rainforest, and the rainforest does grow, like it does kind of expand out.
I'm sure it'll.
Oh, definitely. So it might be able to be recovered, but
it's not something viable in the long run.
Yes, it becomes desert actually, because that was the big thing that I was reading. Was in Brazil, there's areas that are being desertification. I apologize if I'm using the grammar wrong, but there's basically areas of former rainforest turning into desert. Yeah. So that is something that definitely needs to be protected. In terms of the African situation, I think that we need to do more to breed certain exotic animals, because if you look, a lot of these third world countries have a large portion of their GDP invested in trophy hunting, which is kind of strange. And I don't mean like a large, like 25% like our military or something, but you definitely have certain communities that are propped up by rich people from developed nations coming there and wanting to kill a lion or kill an elephant or something like that. So I can understand why they do that, but obviously we can't allow them to do that to the point of extinction with certain animals. So you definitely need to find a way to protect the species, but also allow them to make the money, because it's kind of unfair, because it's kind of like if deer were going extinct or something. We would go work to protect it, but we wouldn't tell every single hunter that they can that they can no longer hunt deer or something like that.
Yeah. 2 points.
So you'd have to treat it kind of like the. You got to treat it like the bald eagle. This is my last point, because I think the bald eagle, if I'm not mistaken, unless it's still illegal because it's a national bird, but I think one endangered bird just came off the list, and now it's totally legal to hunt.
I think I remember.
But I think it might be legal to hunt, and if that's the case, it's like, I guess you got to balance the freedom.
Probably not legal to hunt in the United States, but possibly in probably Canada or more in the northern hemisphere.
That's what I was thinking. Probably Canada, because I don't know if we would let that happen.
Yeah,
we seem too prideful.
Or you can't hunt the national bird. But 2 points I wanted to share real quick, and then we'll wrap this up, that were really interesting, to tie this into the rainforest a little bit. I don't know if this is true, but I heard from someone, a friend of mine who's a beekeeper, and he's a very intelligent man. Speaks with a very, very intellectual aesthetic, and he told me apparently that the cornfields in the United States produce more oxygen than the rainforests could. And when you think about it, it kind of makes sense because of how dense cornfields are. And I think it's
That's interesting.
Yeah, and it's something I definitely do need to look into more.
Justification to cut down the rainforest, though.
Well,
that's not
obviously,
justification.
it's definitely not justification for that. But it's kind of, I think it's a very positive thing. You know what I mean? It doesn't make, it's not like it neutralizes the negative aspect of the rainforests dying, but it kind of gives you a little bit of, it kind of shines a little bit of light into the future as to, well, it's not, it's not as bad as it really could be, but it's still bad, obviously.
I was going to say, because I'm a very a pessimistic person, but if you want my honest opinion, because it's actually the opposite of pessimism, because even though I'm very pessimistic, I want to say that we're nowhere close to destroying the planet beyond repair. I know we keep saying that in terms of global warming and everything, but if you look at the amount of trees and the amount of nature that we actually have, we have quite a bit of ways to go before we, obliterate the planet Fallout style in terms of pollution. But my issue actually is more of aesthetic. I guess I'm more of a romantic in that view, because I actually view the rainforest as just a beautiful ecosystem that we shouldn't have to destroy. And I think a lot of my motivation for wanting to clean up the environment is just the fact that I prefer to live in a clean area. So even though you could, theoretically let trash pile up quite a bit, I mean, you could look at ancient Rome. They had, quite a dirty civilization despite their best efforts. So you can actually live in quite a bit of filth, but I don't think that we should allow that to happen because as civilized people, it's better to live somewhere clean. So more of my motivation is actually surprisingly not like these, alarmists who are like, oh my God, the planet's going to blow up. My motivation's more like, hey, let's just make it look pretty over here.
Certainly, yeah. This has literally been probably like a year or two in the making. God, I should get a fucking cookie for being the king of procrastination. But, yeah, alright. Until next time, this is the Metacast.